Margaery Tyrell had always known her life would be measured by alliances. From the earliest days she could remember, she had been shaped by the needs of her family, the grand strategies that would keep the Tyrell name both relevant and exalted at court. She had learned the subtlety of smiles, the power of beauty, and the weight of promise. Yet, of all the possible destinies she had entertained, never had she imagined her path would lead her to wed Balon Greyjoy, Lord Reaper of Pike and King of the Iron Islands. That such a match would have been unthinkable a year ago only made it all the more chillingly real now. The day this arrangement was first proposed, she had been in her bedchamber at Highgarden, combing out her hair by the open window. The warm, floral fragrance that drifted in from the gardens was a comfort as she hummed a quiet tune. Her reflection in the looking glass showed a face at peace, eyes bright with youth and curiosity. She had gone to bed that night imagining that soon she might wed a Lord of Dorne or perhaps some scion of the Reach's more distant bannermen. There had been whispers once of a betrothal to the crown, or to a prince of the realm who might bind Highgarden more firmly to the Iron Throne. But all had been ephemeral, illusions that drifted away when larger politics took center stage. The next morning, the world changed. A ravaged messenger arrived from the northwestern coasts, battered by a storm and claiming that the Greyjoys were, strangely, open to peace if it came with an alliance. Initially, Margaery scoffed at the idea. House Greyjoy was infamous for a fierce independence that rarely bent to kneel. Their men pillaged, raided, and cared little for the ambitions of the mainland, until it became profitable. But now, as rumor and the winds from the sea carried word of Balon Greyjoy's renewed designs on the coasts, the Tyrell leadership in Highgarden sought ways to keep their own shores secure. In a single council meeting, her grandmother, the sharp-tongued Olenna Tyrell, studied the rumor with her customary dryness. Balon Greyjoy looking for an alliance? Then the world truly has turned on its head, she had said. Still, better we keep an eye on him than let him roam free. Perhaps there is something to be gained if we bring the Iron Islands into our circle. Should we keep them leashed somehow? There was a hush in the solar when Lord Mace Tyrell, Margaery's father, glanced at her from across the table. He mumbled a few words about the notion of a strategic match. Margaery felt a coldness settle at the base of her spine. The entire reach of the Tyrell power had soared during the wars that had roiled the Seven Kingdoms. Highgarden stood as a magnificent seat of wealth, with bountiful harvests and loyal bannermen. But one weakness lingered. House Tyrell, for all its land-based might, had never been masters of the sea. Their fleets were respectable, but the Ironborn had been dominating naval engagements for generations. If Balon Greyjoy truly sought a shift in alliances, if that was even remotely true, then an arranged marriage might tie House Greyjoy to House Tyrell, effectively turning the Iron Fleet's destructive potential away from Highgarden's coasts and perhaps upon the enemies of the Tyrells. Over the following weeks, Margaery's role as a political pawn crystallized. Scrolls arrived bearing stamped seals, the dire wolf of the north voicing concerns, the lion of the Westerlands sending veiled threats, the stag in the Crownlands rumored to be withered to irrelevance. Amid that swirl of alliances and tensions, the Rose of Highgarden, as Margaery was sometimes called, was told that Balon Greyjoy was indeed open to negotiation. There was no flamboyant pretense of love, no illusions there. It was a pragmatic arrangement. The Greyjoys wanted more trade in the southwestern waters where Highgarden's influence ran deep, and they craved a bit of mainland recognition after their rebellions had mostly ended in half-measures and humiliations. The Tyrells, in turn, wanted the Iron Fleet on their side as they sought to expand or defend their vantage along the Mander and beyond. Margaery was neither naive nor powerless in the matter. She was adept at employing her charm. She considered traveling to Pike in an official diplomatic capacity to see Balon Greyjoy for herself, but it was decided that the negotiations would happen at Riverrun, a neutral location that could host both sides without giving advantage. There, in the storied halls of the Tully seat, now more or less an open ground for such summits, she first laid eyes on Balon Greyjoy. The Lord Reaper of Pike was not a man to ignore. He stood taller than she had imagined, shoulders broad beneath a cloak fashioned from the skins of some creature of the sea. His hair was grizzled and long, salt and pepper mixed with tangles from the brine-laced winds. He had hard, sea-gray eyes, and his mouth was set in a determined grimace, as though he regarded every conversation as a prelude to war. Margaery felt the difference between them, an almost painful friction of land and sea. Where she was used to politeness and hidden barbs, the Ironborn's nature was direct. The negotiations were not sealed in an afternoon. Balon's daughter, Yara Greyjoy, stood close by, arms folded, her face unreadable except for the flicker of amusement when Margaery spoke in that gracious tone for which she was famed. Lords from both sides hammered out trade rights. Tongues wagged about the terms under which the Iron Fleet might defend the Mander. Margaery provided sweet smiles and polite commentary, offering a sense of calm. There was a night of feasting, if one could call it that, though it was stunted by the tension in the hall. But something about Margaery's demeanor captured Balon's attention, or perhaps his ambition. He was old enough to be her father, yes, but on Pike such considerations held little sway. He considered only advantages, power, and how best to secure them. By the week's end, he declared his willingness to bind House Greyjoy to House Tyrell, on condition that Margaery be his bride. Outrage shimmered in the eyes of some of the Tyrell bannermen. They considered it an insult, perhaps, that a man notorious for cruelty and rebellion should aspire to wed their beloved Rose. But Margaery stood, lifting her chin with regal grace, and responded with a measured acceptance. She had weighed the cost in her mind. If she refused, war would be the next step. Raids along the coasts, burned fishing villages, a prolonged stalemate that would grind down the Tyrell forces and hamper the realm's harvests. If she accepted, she might find a path to shape the Iron Islands from within. She might steer Balon Greyjoy's ferocity away from the Reach and toward any who dared to threaten her family. Perhaps it was a cunning plan. Perhaps it was folly. However, the wedding was set. The betrothal was announced in the Great Hall of Riverrun. The final details were hammered out in a swirl of frowns and raised voices among lords of the Reach. But Mace Tyrell was swayed by Olenna, who saw in the arrangement a bright possibility. If the old squid wants to pretend he has the sun's favor by taking our little Rose, let him. We'll harvest more from this alliance than they can guess. Margaery forced a smile as she heard those words, ignoring the gnawing in her belly that whispered of storms. She allowed herself to be robed in Tyrell green and gold for the brief ceremony that announced the betrothal. Balon's voice was as rough as the sea when he spoke. Within 2 months, preparations for the official wedding were completed, and Margaery found herself traveling to the Iron Islands. The journey by sea was rougher than any she had experienced. The waves seemed like living beasts beneath the hull of the ship. She spent much of the voyage on the upper deck, face pale, though she willed herself not to appear weak before the grim-faced Ironborn. Her retinue was smaller than she would have liked. Ser Loras Tyrell, her beloved brother, was busy in the Reach, ensuring that their homeland remained secure. She had several Tyrell cousins and ladies in waiting with her, none of them enthusiastic about the notion of setting foot on Pike for a wedding. But necessity led them onward. Pike itself was a fortress carved by the cruelty of wind and wave. Towers rose upon rocky outcrops, connected by bridges suspended over a raging sea. The sky was almost always gray, seagulls circling overhead with dissonant cries. Margaery tried to imagine a life here, so far from the perfumed gardens and bright corridors of Highgarden. Yet she was no stranger to adaptation. She had learned the game at King's Landing once, schooling herself to outshine or outmaneuver the vipers and lions that roamed those halls. Perhaps she could find a way to thrive here, in the cold domain of the Ironborn. The wedding day arrived in a swirl of salt and wind. Balon stood in his dark finery, more akin to a raider's regalia than anything that might be called ceremonial. Margaery wore a gown of green velvet, trimmed with gold threads shaped like vines and leaves, though the brisk wind that whipped across Pike's courtyard threatened to tangle her hair and tear her skirts. The Septon who conducted the ceremony came from the mainland, his voice trembling as he presided over a union that felt like an uneasy truce. The lords and captains of the Iron Islands gathered about, wearing grim smiles. Only a few from the Reach stood near Margaery, among them Lady Alice Beesbury and Lord Cletus Mullendore. She missed her brother Loras desperately, but she consoled herself that someone had to secure Highgarden during this transitional time. When Balon spoke his vows, they felt hollow and yet potent. "I take you for my wife, to join House Greyjoy and House Tyrell, and bring forth salt and stone with root and stem." He took her hand, his grip firm as an iron shackle. Margaery gazed into those sea-gray eyes, forging a smile that betrayed none of her fear. "I take you, Balon Greyjoy, as my husband and lord, to stand with me in peace or war, and to know that House Tyrell's rose shall bloom beside the Kraken." The words were carefully scripted, but inside she felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Was she forging a new path for her family's prosperity, or had she just delivered herself into a cage shaped like a throne of black rock? When the ceremony ended, the Ironborn roared in approval, or at least in savage curiosity. Margaery felt cold as a gust of wind tugged at her veil. The feast that followed was raucous, more reminiscent of a raider's celebration than a wedding. Barrels of ale and sour wine were emptied. The smell of fish and roasted mutton pervaded the hall. Servants rushed to and fro, refilling trenchers and clearing away broken jugs. Minstrels from the Reach tried to play lively tunes, but soon found themselves drowned out by the sea shanties of the Ironborn. Over the clamor, Balon raised his voice to declare that the seas around the Reach now belonged to the Greyjoys, by right of marriage. Though he said it jestingly, Margaery caught the undercurrent of truth. She could see the fervor in the eyes of many captains. They revered Balon's strength and cunning, but they also harbored a certain curiosity about this new bride from the Green Lands. That night was her wedding night, and it passed in tense intimacy. Margaery steeled herself for it, as any woman must in her wedding bed. Balon's presence was overwhelming, a force that smelled of brine and sweat. She thought to herself, "If I endure, if I maintain composure, I may yet guide this man's power to more than just raiding. Perhaps I can harness it for Highgarden's sake." It was a vow she made to herself, silent and resolute. She woke the next morning an Ironborn's wife. Rumors spread quickly through the realm. Lords in the Reach marveled and sometimes grumbled in dismay. The Lannisters at Casterly Rock paid attention, uncertain whether to treat this union as a threat or a boon. The North, battered by its own strife, watched from afar. In King's Landing, the small council seats whispered about how Margaery Tyrell, known for her diplomatic brilliance, had placed herself in Balon Greyjoy's bed. Some speculated that Balon would try once more to declare himself king of the Isles and the Reach, echoing the old Ironborn expansions. Others believed Margaery's presence would soften his ambitions and bring the Iron Islands into the fold of stability. For her part, Margaery had no illusions about softening Balon. She saw him as a blunt instrument, a man of singular will, but that also meant he was predictable in a sense. She could learn to read the tides of his mood. Over the following weeks, she began the delicate work of bridging the gap between Pike and Highgarden. She wrote letters to her grandmother Olenna, describing the rocky spires, the iron bridges, and the savage loyalty of Balon's men. She tried to describe the sea in a way that conveyed both its majesty and its menace. She confided in those letters her strategy. If she could persuade Balon that focusing raids on the Westerlands would bring more gold, or that the Stormlands offered a path to more plunder, the Reach would remain unharassed. Then, with the Iron Fleet effectively an ally of Highgarden, Mace Tyrell could expand trade routes up the coasts, and the threat of Lannister retribution would be checked. The seeds of that plan took root. In council meetings on Pike, Margaery attended at Balon's side, wearing the Kraken sigil pinned beside the rose. She was met with derision from some Ironborn lords who muttered that the woman from the Greenlands had no place here. But Balon insisted she remain. She listened carefully to their talk of new raids, the hunger for reaving, the desire to set the Iron Fleet upon unsuspecting coasts. When the question arose of pillaging the southwestern shores of the Reach, Margaery spoke up, reminding them that the Tyrells now stood beside the Ironborn. It would not be wise to undermine that bond. She shifted their attention to other targets. The shipping lanes near Lannisport, the Stormlanders' coastlines, or even the stepstones for freebooters' gold. Balon rarely denied her suggestions outright. Sometimes, She saw the calculating gleam in his eye, as if he recognized the use of having a wife with a keen political mind. Her presence at his side gave him an aura of legitimacy among some of the lords of Westeros, who might otherwise ignore him as a perennial rebel. The first sign of the alliance's tangible value came when a small ironborn fleet, newly provisioned, attacked and seized a cluster of Lannister merchant vessels laden with gold and spices. Balon declared it a victory for the Iron Islands and the Reach alike, for had not his marriage to Margaery spurred him to such swift action? Margaery herself allowed a soft smile, privately noting how swiftly the Reavers had turned from the southwestern coasts to the northwestern ones. As the weeks stretched into months, Margaery's life on Pike settled into a routine of careful maneuvering. The wind-swept fortress remained cold, a stark contrast to the warm halls of Highgarden. But she adapted. She found corners of the keep where she might plant some greenery in pots, tiny blossoms that reminded her of the sun-kissed reach of her homeland. She continued to wear gowns of soft green and gold, even if she had to drape herself in heavier cloaks. The old, sea-worn stones of Pike had rarely seen such finery, and whispers circulated among the Ironborn that their new lady was a rare creature indeed. She found an unlikely ally in Yara Greyjoy, Balon's daughter. Yara had her own skepticism about the Union. She had been raised in a world that valued fierce independence, and she had no patience for idle courtesies. Yet she came to respect Margaery's quick mind. Sometimes she would join Margaery for brief walks across Pike's narrow bridges, though the swirling waves below nearly deafened them. In the salty air, the two women exchanged guarded words. Yara was frank, explaining that many of the captains doubted that Balon would truly hold to an alliance if it didn't yield him new conquests. Margaery, in turn, explained her hope that more stable routes of commerce and plunder, focused away from the Reach, would benefit both sides. Yara, though not one for elaborate politics, saw the sense in it. "We Ironborn want gold and glory," she said plainly. "If that's to be found harassing Lannister ships rather than Tyrell ones, so be it." Slowly, Margaery used the channels she had: letters to her grandmother, messages to her father and brother, discreet words to traveling merchants, to orchestrate a quiet transformation. The Iron Fleet, once unpredictable, gradually found that the ships from Highgarden offered them valuable goods, fresh produce, even wine at reduced cost, if they cooperated in ensuring those merchantmen were safe from raids. In turn, the Tyrells began to see that the Greyjoys could be a fearsome deterrent to any who threatened the Mander from the west. Balon, still the self-styled king of salt and rock in his heart, relished the sense of rising power. He took Margaery to a vantage point atop Pike's highest tower, and from there the view of the sea was immense. He would speak of the ancient days when the Ironborn had ruled the coasts from Old Town to Bear Island, striking terror wherever they landed. She listened, letting him recount the glories of Hor and other ancient Iron Kings. In time, she would gently remind him how such unbridled ambition had ultimately failed them. "Be cunning in how you wage war, my lord," she would say softly. "Strike only where we can gain without cost." He'd nod, sometimes curtly. The idea of measured warfare was new to him. So many of his ancestors believed in reaving until the seas ran red, consequences be damned. But Margaery stood by him, a green and gold presence that gave a veneer of sophistication to Balon's court. Inevitably, the rest of Westeros took notice, and not just in passing. As reports circulated of Greyjoy longships attacking Lannister supply lines, Tywin Lannister, had he still been alive, would have taken immediate, decisive action. But the Lannisters were themselves in a precarious position, caught between unrest in the Crownlands and debts that weighed heavily upon them. Their new leadership was not as imposing, and so the Iron Fleet met less resistance than one might expect. The Tyrells, disclaiming official involvement, quietly funneled more resources to ensure Pike's shipyards were well supplied with timber from the Reach. The once lonely corridors of Pike began to reflect Margaery's presence in subtle ways. Tapestries that had hung in Highgarden or had been purchased from traveling tradesmen now graced a few of the stonier walls. Servants, clad in a mixture of Greyjoy black and gold and Tyrell green and gold, bustled about. Margaery insisted that the keep's kitchens learn a few more recipes from the Reach, if only to spice the daily fare. Occasionally, she would preside over small feasts where Balon's captains and Tyrell envoys mingled in an uneasy camaraderie. At these gatherings, Margaery used her well-practiced talents of courtesy to ease tensions, listening for the undercurrents of resentment or suspicion that might threaten her alliance. The greatest test of this uneasy arrangement arrived soon after, when the new Lord Paramount of the Westerlands, Kevan Lannister's heir or perhaps another Lannister cousin, decided that enough was enough. A blockade was formed near Fair Isle, an attempt to cut off the Iron Fleet from reaching the southern seas. With their shipping threatened, Balon raged for days, snapping at those around him. They think they can contain the Ironborn like pen swine? I'll show them, he hissed in Margaery's presence. He demanded that the Tyrells send their own ships to break the blockade at once, as a demonstration of good faith. Margaery, quick on her feet, soothed him. If we engage the Lannister blockade openly, it will be war, she told him. But Highgarden has ways to circumvent such challenges. Our ships are not as numerous, but we do hold alliances with smaller lords who have ports along the coast. If we can coordinate a pincer maneuver, or if we can lure the blockade away with a false trail of merchant ships rumored to be carrying gold. She considered many ruses, balancing the risk of full-scale confrontation. In the end, she devised a cunning plan. Spread word that a large Tyrell treasure fleet would leave the Arbor, heavily laden, within the week. Let the Lannisters come for it, chasing illusions of wine and gold. Meanwhile, the Iron Fleet would slip around from the north, guided by two of Margaery's more experienced navigators who understood the coastline intimately. Then they would strike the blockade from the rear. It was a gambit that required perfect timing. Balon, initially skeptical of such trickery, soon relished the idea of surprising the Lannisters. He dispatched Yara at the head of a squadron, instructing her to follow Margaery's plan. And so it was that, a fortnight later, in the gray light of dawn, the Lannister ships discovered too late that they were outflanked. While the Lannister commander waited to pounce on a non-existent treasure fleet, Yara's ships closed in. The blockade was shattered in a pitched battle. Ironborn axes and arrows rained down upon the Lannisters. Meanwhile, a small Tyrell squadron, appearing from the south, confounded any possibility of retreat. The result was a resounding victory for the Greyjoy-Tyrell alliance. When the news reached Pike, Balon was exultant. He clasped Margaery by the shoulders in front of his men and declared that she, too, had the salt in her veins. Margaery endured the stench of ale on his breath and the coarse cheers of the Ironborn. That night, a grand feast was held in Pike's great hall. The Ironborn roared with laughter, retelling tales of the day's triumph, while Margaery offered a graceful presence at Balon's side. A sense of pride kindled within her. Pride that she had outmaneuvered the Lannisters, that she had preserved her homeland's interests, and that she had proven her worth to these stern men of the sea. In truth, she felt a twinge of guilt at the knowledge of the men who had died in the waters near Fair Isle. But she reminded herself that this was the cost of the game they all played. In her letters to Highgarden, she wrote more confidently now. The seas are ours if we are wise in how we hold them. She urged her father and grandmother to strengthen the trade networks, to open new lines of commerce through the Shield Islands, offering safe passage for merchant vessels that swore fealty or paid tribute to House Tyrell. Of course, part of that tribute would trickle to Pike. Balon's pockets were filled, and the Iron Fleet never lacked for supplies. Bit by bit, Margaery and her family shaped a maritime dominion that put the Greyjoy sigil beside the Tyrell Rose, dominating from the Mander's Mouth up to the edges of the Sunset Sea. As her influence grew, Margaery's presence among the Ironborn evolved from tolerated outsider to a figure of real respect. The fisherfolk at the base of Pike's Cliffs began to greet her with a hesitant bow, or at least a bob of the head, acknowledging that she was not just a fancy Greenlander. After all, had she not brought them victory and gold? The reavers who sailed with Yara returned with spoils, praising the cunning counsel that flowed from their lady. Margaery never tried to appear as one of them. She knew that acceptance only went so far, but she carved a space for herself in their culture. She learned their customs, their intense respect for the old ways of the drowned god, though she remained faithful to the Seven in her own quiet manner. She never openly disparaged their beliefs, instead adapting as best she could. On certain feast days, she would even stand at Balon's side in the watery courtyard of Pike's Great Keep, watching as a priest droned old prayers. Word reached King's Landing of these developments, and the fragmented crown's response was uncertain. Some whispered that Margaery Tyrell had turned traitor to the realm by empowering Balon Greyjoy. Others recognized that the Tyrells were now in a position of naval supremacy on the west coast, which made them formidable. No matter the gossip, letters from the crown seldom held real threats, as the monarchy was embroiled in other crises. Bandits, rebellious lords in the Riverlands, a depleted treasury. Margaery read those letters and set them aside with mild amusement. They needed her more than she needed them, yet alliances in Westeros can shift as quickly as the tide. It was not long before the newly emboldened Greyjoys set their sights further south, eyeing Old Town and the wealth that passed through its harbor. Margaery cautioned against attacking the Hightowers outright, pointing out that the Hightower was one of the great bannermen of the Tyrells, and that any assault on Old Town would be a direct blow to her own family. Balon, flushed with victory, argued that the Ironborn had every right to test their strength where they willed. Tension crackled between them. If there was one line Margaery could not allow him to cross, it was the direct assault on Highgarden's greatest city and the seat of the faith. Over long nights, she employed every art of persuasion she possessed. Sometimes that meant meeting Balon's anger head-on. Other times, it meant gentle suggestions about more profitable targets beyond the southern seas. "Think of the Summer Isles," she would say, weaving visions of exotic spices and precious dyes. "Think of the Stepstones where pirates roam. Conquest there would cement your legend more than capturing a city that's already half loyal to you through me." And at times, though she felt a wave of revulsion, she would seduce him in private, turning his passions into a more pliable state of mind. She hated the necessity of it, but recognized the power such intimacy granted her in shaping his decisions. Gradually, he agreed to set aside immediate designs on Old Town. In the midst of this delicate balancing act, Ser Loras Tyrell finally came to Pike, leading a small retinue of knights from the Reach. He arrived without fanfare, in the midst of a rain-lashed dusk. Margaery greeted him in one of the main halls, tears sparkling in her eyes. She had missed him fiercely, but to show too much raw emotion before the Ironborn might suggest weakness. Instead, she welcomed him with a measured embrace, then guided him to a private solar. There, in the dim light of a brazier, sister and brother spoke in hushed tones. Loras expressed his concern, seeing the changes in Margaery. The lines of her face seemed more determined, and her gaze had a flinty resolve born of the storms around Pike. He worried that Balon Greyjoy was using her as a puppet to further his own ends. Margaery assured him that it was she who was using Balon. "He believes he's winning, yes, but we shape the battlefield." She outlined her vision of a combined Tyrell Greyjoy maritime force that would keep the southern seas under their control. If the Lannisters or Baratheons rose against them, they would find themselves outmatched at sea. Loras still had reservations, especially about Balon's cruelty, but he admitted that the Tyrell hold on the seas was stronger than ever. He had spoken to some knights from the Arbor who told him how merchant ships flew under a safe passage arrangement brokered by Margaery, paying a fraction of the cost they once did in bribes or ransoms. The Ironborn, for the most part, no longer harassed Tyrell shipping, except for a few rogue captains who swiftly learned that crossing the Lady of Pike came with consequences. The last such captain to seize a Tyrell merchantman found his ship mysteriously scuttled off the coast of Great White, with the weight of Balon's fury and Margaery's private demands behind the punishment. To maintain her power, Margaery walked a razor's edge. She had to placate Balon's thirst for conquest while protecting the Reach. She had to ensure the Ironborn captains remained loyal to her husband while preventing them from openly attacking her homeland. She also had to keep the flow of wealth moving so the marriage would continue to seem worthwhile. And always, she felt the eyes of her Ironborn allies upon her, judging her. She learned to speak their tongue in short, guttural bursts, addressing the captains with a sprinkling of the old dialect. She even embraced a tradition where once a year, she cast an offering into the sea in thanks for its bounty. In truth, she prayed in her heart to the Seven, but the symbolism appeased Balon's men. Meanwhile, the Tyrells thrived. The harvests were bountiful, trade increased, and the wealth of Highgarden grew. Lords who had once ridiculed Mace Tyrell for a union with the Ironborn now lined up to offer their own marriages or pacts, seeking a share in the spoils. There were still underlying fears. What if Balon turned on the Reach one day? What if the Iron Fleet decided that the Golden Fields would make for easy prey? But Margaery quietly reassured her family that Balon would never do so while she commanded his ear. And command it she did. In the privacy of their bedchamber, she found ways to temper Balon's rough impulses. He was not a gentle man, but he had come to appreciate the cunning that Margaery brought to his cause. Over and over, she proved to him that a carefully planned strike brought greater profit than a reckless raid. She reinforced his vanity, calling him the mightiest sea king in the known world, building his sense that together, they would overshadow the Muling kings on the mainland. In so doing, she also shaped his next moves, carefully directing the Iron Fleet to battles or raids that aligned with Tyrell interests. Over time, a steady pattern emerged. Any foe that threatened the Reach from the western seas found themselves hammered by the Greyjoy ships, while Tyrell vessels aided in blocking their retreat. The synergy of the two houses at sea was unstoppable. In public, Margaery perfected the image of the proud Krakenrose queen, standing at Balon's side, wearing an austere smile. She allowed rumors to swirl that she possessed some enchantment from the sea, that no wave could harm her. She did nothing to dissuade the Ironborn from attributing her counsel to watery omens. She accepted the symbolic driftwood crown that Balon insisted she hold during certain feasts, though she never placed it on her own head. The message was that she was his partner, not his rival. It was a careful dance, blending mainland courtesy with Ironborn ferocity. Despite all these successes, tensions began to accumulate like dark clouds on the horizon. Balon's older nature still lurked beneath his acceptance of these cunning strategies. He had grown older, yet his hunger for a grand legacy only sharpened. At times, he would gaze out at the ocean and speak of the old Ironborn realm that had included the Riverlands, the Trident, and vast swaths of the coast. Margaery would remind him that the Riverlands were now under other powers, that the cost of holding them would be ruinous. But he would only grunt, his mind drifting to fantasies of unending conquest. The day finally came when a large Lannister force, bolstered by alliances in the Westerlands, set sail in an attempt to challenge the Iron Fleet again, this time near the mouth of the Mander itself. Perhaps they reasoned that to strike close to Highgarden would force the Tyrells to turn on the Greyjoys or risk seeing their own lands invaded. Margaery received frantic letters from lords along the Mander's lower banks. They warned that a blockade at the mouth would choke off trade and starve the region of essential supplies. Time was short. Loras, who had returned to Highgarden, sent a raven urging his sister to bring the Iron Fleet to the Mander's defense at once. Balon was initially reluctant. "Why should my men bleed for the Mander? We are Ironborn, not Tyrell thralls," he growled when Margaery showed him the pleas. She realized that if he refused to act, the alliance would buckle. The Lannisters would stifle Tyrell shipping, potentially break the alliance from the inside. She appealed to Balon's pride. "If you let them blockade the Mander, they will say the Kraken is toothless. They will claim the Iron Fleet cannot rival the Lannisters in open waters. Is that what you want the lords of Westeros to think?" Balon's nostrils flared. He scoffed, spitting on the floor in disdain. "No man calls me toothless." And so, a great muster of Ironborn ships set sail from Pike, flying the Kraken banner, with a contingent of Tyrell vessels among them. Margaery insisted on accompanying the fleet, saying she must see her homeland defended. Balon refused at first, but she stood her ground. In the end, he agreed, perhaps secretly proud to have his landborn queen see the Iron Fleet in full glory. The crossing took days, battered by storms, but the sea was as alive with their presence as Margaery had ever seen. Row upon row of longships cut through the waves, the crash of water against hulls like the beat of a war drum. Margaery stood near the prow of Balon's flagship, hair whipping about her face, heart pounding. If she failed here, it would all come crashing down. They reached the mouth of the Mander at dawn. The Lannister ships, bold in their attempt, had formed a blockade of war galleys and smaller support vessels. The golden lion banners fluttered in the wind. The sun broke over the horizon, gilding the waters with a coppery light. Balon wasted no time. He ordered the horns sounded, a deep, mournful call that echoed across the sea. From her vantage, Margaery could see the Tyrell ships maneuvering in from behind, a well-timed pincer. The Lannisters, aware of the Ironborn approach, scrambled to form battle lines. What ensued was a naval engagement that would be remembered in the annals of Westeros for a generation. The Iron Fleet surged forward, rams smashing into Lannister hulls, reavers pouring across decks with axes and salt-rusted blades. The Tyrell ships, better armed with scorpions and ballistae, fired bolts that tore sails and masts asunder. Balon's flagship slammed into the Lannister command vessel, and Balon himself, old though he was, led the boarding party. Margaery remained behind the lines, flanked by trusted guards, her heart in her throat as she heard the clash of steel and the cries of dying men. Smoke billowed as some ships caught fire. The waters churned with debris and bodies. By midday, the blockade was in tatters. Lannister casualties were severe. A few vessels tried to flee, but the Ironborn gave chase, cutting them off. At the final decisive moment, Margaery signaled for the Tyrell ships to close ranks, ensuring no stragglers escaped. She saw the warlike smile on Balon's face as he raised a bloodied axe. The sight both repulsed and relieved her, for it meant victory was theirs. After the battle, the Mander's mouth was slick with oil and blood. Countless men had perished, many from the Iron Islands as well as the Westerlands. But the blockade was ended. The Tyrell banners flew triumphant alongside the Kraken. Margaery could see, on the shores, small gatherings of farmers and fisherfolk cheering, for their supply routes would be reopened. She felt an odd mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. This was the monstrous face of war, but at least it served to protect her homeland. News of the victory spread quickly across the Reach. The Tyrells now had no rival on the western seas, not the Lannisters nor any other power. Balon's name once more struck fear into coastal villages, except those allied to Highgarden, who found themselves spared or even enriched by trade. Margaery's prestige soared, both in the eyes of her family's bannermen and among Balon's captains. She had proven she could guide the Iron Fleet to triumph in the mainland's defense, harnessing the Reaver's ferocity for her own ends. Whispers called her the Queen of the Sunset Sea, a moniker she publicly dismissed but privately found gratifying. As the next year passed, the alliance stabilized, forging a maritime empire that spanned from the Shield Islands up to the edges of the Westerlands. Tyrell merchants carried goods far and wide, the Ironborn pocketing their cut. Loras, returning again to Pike, admitted he had underestimated the plan. "You have turned the Ironborn into a shield for Highgarden," he told Margaery in confidence. "But I worry, sister. One day, Balon may decide he no longer needs us." Margaery pursed her lips, acknowledging the possibility. "That is why I must remain indispensable," she said. "As long as he believes I am the key to his glory, to the wealth that flows from these alliances, he will not betray us. But if ever he sees more profit elsewhere—" She trailed off, letting Loras fill in the unspoken threat. That day might come sooner or later, she knew. But for the moment, House Tyrell soared. Old Town thrived, the Mander teemed with trade, and the name of Margaery Tyrell Greyjoy became a legend. Children in the Reach sang songs about the Rose who tamed the Kraken. Children on Pike whispered about the Greenlander Queen who shed no tears at the tide's violence. Margaery thought often of the legacy she was building. She had once yearned to be the queen of all Westeros, married to a king who sat the Iron Throne. But she had gained a different crown instead. The roiling sea, the salt-soaked wind, the intangible power of maritime might. In some ways, it was more tangible than the throne in King's Landing, for the city on the Blackwater was beset by intrigues. Here on Pike, though harsh and bleak, she controlled her destiny to a remarkable degree. Balon, for his part, reveled in his renewed reputation as the most feared Sea Lord in the West. He declared new expansions, sending reaver parties to harry the coasts of Dorne, an ill-advised move, Margaery thought, though it was far enough from the Reach that she did not protest too strongly. His name was again recognized as a king in all but official title. The small council in King's Landing, fearful of confrontation, tried to offer him meaningless concessions in the hope that he would remain far from their shores. Margaery wrote back to Olenna, describing it all. They bend over backward to keep him from sacking their ports. Imagine what might happen if we shift our sights on the Crownlands. Even the Red Keep might tremble if the Iron Fleet came up the Blackwater. Olenna's reply was typically wry. Perhaps we shall have a new occupant in the Red Keep, one who can keep the whores and fools in line. But let's not be hasty. Gold is to be made before we hoist any more banners. Margaery smiled at that. Her grandmother was as sharp as ever. Still, beneath her outward confidence, Margaery sensed the darker shadows creeping in. Balon's drive for conquest was like a beast that could never be fully sated. She saw him grow restless. He spoke of the Stepstones, of sending a host of ships to carve out a dominion that would bring them even more wealth. Yara, pragmatic as ever, tried to point out the dangers. But Balon insisted that if the Tyrells could be compelled to lend support, the Stepstones might become a base from which to raid Essos itself. Margaery tried to steer him to more moderate expansions, but his eyes burned with a hunger she recognized all too well. She worried that if he pushed too far, the alliances they built would crack. The Tyrells might not be willing to bleed their forces in a protracted campaign so far from home. One night, as the wind howled outside Pike's Towers, Margaery and Balon lay abed. She was exhausted from the day's skirmishes of diplomacy, but he was awake, eyes glinting in the torchlight. He began to speak in a low growl about the old ways, how the Ironborn had once carved their empire through fearless brutality. Margaery realized then that no matter how many cunning strategies she offered, part of him longed for unrestrained conquest. In that moment, she wrapped her arms around him, pressing her cheek to his bare chest, listening to his heartbeat. She told him softly of the legends of Garth Greenhand, of the fertility and life that the Reach carried. She spun a story of how the Ironborn might become lords not just of reavers and raids, but of prosperity and dominion that stretched across the seas. She flattered him, painting a future where the Greyjoy name would endure, not as a memory of a drowned rebellion but as a pillar of power. Balon listened, silent, his breath ragged. In the morning he said little, but she saw a thoughtful glimmer in his eye. Perhaps she had succeeded in staying his hand, at least for now. Winter loomed on the horizon. The nights grew long, and the sea storms more frequent. The Ironborn tended to withdraw to their island keeps during the worst of the weather, telling tales around smoky fires, forging plans for the spring. Margaery found this an ideal time to solidify her relationships with the lords of the Iron Islands. She hosted dinners where she carefully placed them in conversation with Tyrell emissaries, spurring talk of mutual ventures. She even arranged marriages between lesser branches of House Tyrell's bannermen and Ironborn captains, forging a complicated tapestry of blood ties that would make it harder for either side to sever the alliance. Slowly, she bound them together, ensuring that if one side rebelled, the other would pay a steep price in lost allies. During one such winter feast, a traveling bard sang a ballad about a rose blossoming on the cliffs of Pike, uniting salt and soil. Margaery pretended not to notice Balon's guarded scowl at the mention of uniting the Ironborn with the Greenlanders. Yet the men laughed and drank, raising their cups in a toast. By that point, none could deny that Margaery Tyrell had accomplished a remarkable feat. She had persuaded the Iron Islands to become an ally, if not a vassal, of Highgarden, harnessing their brutal might for Tyrell advantage. The best part, for many, was that it came with a flow of wealth, not the usual devastation that the Ironborn so often left in their wake. Yet Margaery knew that victory was always on the edge of a sword in Westeros. Should Balon fall in battle or succumb to illness, the Ironborn might splinter. Yara might assume control, or Theon, if he were still recognized by his father. But in either scenario, the stability of the arrangement might fracture. To guard against that, Margaery quietly cultivated a rapport with Yara, ensuring that if the day came when Balon was gone, she could call on Yara's sense of reason to keep the alliance intact. It was a delicate line to walk without stirring Balon's suspicions. Months melted into one another. The Iron Islands and the Reach, separate worlds, joined in a fragile harmony. Margaery would occasionally return to Highgarden, escorted by a small contingent of Ironborn. The strange sight of salt-hardened reavers riding through the lush fields of the Reach always caused a stir. She would confer with her father and grandmother, ensuring the next phases of expansion remained on track, then sail back to Pike to keep Balon's ambitions in check. In one of those visits, she walked the gardens of Highgarden with Olenna by her side. The Queen of Thorns, aged but unbowed, pressed her granddaughter. "Are you truly happy, child?" Margaery had paused, inhaling the sweet perfume of roses that was so absent from Pike. "Happiness is a luxury we can rarely afford," she said finally, with a sad smile. "But I am content, grandmother, that I serve the Reach, and I have found a strange kind of purpose in shaping Balon's might toward our ends." Olenna gave a slight, approving nod. "Just don't lose yourself in the process. Power is fickle, especially in that watery fortress." Margaery knew the truth of those words. She resolved to remain vigilant. As winter began to wane, Balon announced that, with the changing winds, he wished to launch a grand voyage. An expedition, he called it, to prove the Iron Fleet's supremacy. He hinted at striking somewhere distant, perhaps the Summer Isles or maybe the coasts of Essos. Margaery recognized the potential pitfalls. A far-flung campaign would consume resources, and if it failed, all they had built would be at risk. She debated with him, urging caution. But Balon was adamant. "We must show all the world that we are not content to sit idle," he said. "Let them quiver at our approach." In the end, Margaery's entreaties tempered the plan slightly, turning it into a smaller show of force, perhaps an excursion to the Basilisk Isles for plunder, or a foray near the disputed lands to capture merchant ships. But the seeds of ambition were still there, and Margaery felt an unspoken dread that one day Balon might overreach, tearing asunder the alliance so painstakingly built. For now, however, the seas belonged to the Tyrell Greyjoy alliance. Mariners from Dorne to the north acknowledged that the Mander was an impenetrable gateway, guarded by iron longships in concert with Tyrell galleys. Pirate bands whispered that the Lady of Pike and Highgarden had eyes in every port. When Balon commanded a muster, longships slid from every island harbor, forming a terrifying silhouette on the horizon. When Margaery wrote to her father about new trade treaties, merchants scrambled to pay their dues, knowing that the alternative was to face the Iron Fleet's wrath. In effect, she had accomplished what many had once deemed impossible, turning the Ironborn's savage strength into a protective bulwark and an instrument of economic power for Highgarden. Her personal life, however, remained a constant negotiation. Nights with Balon were seldom tender, though there were moments he displayed something akin to begrudging respect. He would whisper in her ear about distant conquests, and she would whisper back about the necessity of stable alliances. It was a never-ending dance of influences. By day, she had to maintain the gracious facade that the Ironborn had come to appreciate, or at least accept. By night, she worked to keep Balon from making rash decisions. At times, she questioned if she had lost part of herself in the process, the girl who once dreamt of chivalric knights and courtly romance. But she reminded herself that she was no longer that girl. She was a queen of the seas, or near enough, forging a new destiny for House Tyrell. Days flowed into seasons, and a second autumn arrived since her wedding. By then, the seas seemed calm in the west, though that calm was always threatened by storms. The Lannisters had been pushed back, forced to concentrate on land-based defenses. King's Landing continued to falter, lacking the resources to challenge the combined might of the Tyrells and Greyjoys at sea. Dorne was quiet, preferring trade to open conflict. Even the North, battered by its own internal woes, had no means of challenging the new maritime empire. In Pike's tallest tower, Margaery sometimes stood alone, gazing out over the restless ocean. She would breathe in the salty air, listening to the screech of gulls. Once, She had dreaded this place, but now it was her seat of power. She recalled the day she first arrived, trembling and uncertain, and she marveled at how the pieces had fallen into place. There were times she felt a flicker of pride, seeing how skillfully she had manipulated the currents of politics to secure her family's interests. Yet she always kept a measure of caution. The sea could change in an instant, and so could Balon Greyjoy. But perhaps that was the secret. A constant readiness to shift with the tide, holding the rose above the waves even as they thundered in. And so it was that Margaery Tyrell, wed to Balon Greyjoy, presided over a new era of dominion for Highgarden, its reach extending across the waters it had once feared. The melding of Ironborn ferocity and Tyrell cunning ensured that no ship sailed the Sunset Sea without acknowledging their power. Old alliances crumbled. New ones sprang forth, all revolving around the gravitational pull of the Kraken and the Rose. In hushed corridors of the Red Keep, courtiers whispered that Margaery had become more formidable than any queen who had ever worn a crown in King's Landing. She had claimed no throne of metal, but rather a throne of wind and wave, intangible and yet unassailable, as vast as the horizon itself. If there was ever a lesson in her story, it was this: in Westeros, power belongs to those who seize it by knowing how to shape the hearts and fears of others. Margaery Tyrell had wed Balon Greyjoy, not out of love, but out of necessity and ambition. And through that union, she had brought the Iron Islands and the Reach into a strange and potent partnership that commanded the seas. Where once the Rose and the Kraken had been separate forces, one born of sunlight and fertile soil, the other dragged from the depths of salt and stone, they were now intertwined, forging a future in which Highgarden reigned supreme along the coasts, protected by tentacles of iron. And as Margaery stood upon the parapets of Pike, the waves crashing endlessly below, she knew she had become more than a mere pawn on the board. She had become its quiet, graceful master, guiding the currents of war and alliance with a serene smile, even as the sea winds whipped at her skirts and the cry of the gulls echoed her name. Yet even the most masterful weavers of fate cannot prevent every loose thread from unraveling. Margaery Tyrell Greyjoy, the Kraken's Rose, sensed how the balance she had so carefully maintained could shift in the smallest breeze. She had already seen how Balon's ambitions wavered between cunning restraint, stoked by her political counsel, and the unbridled ferocity of old Ironborn ways. The Iron Islands might have been tamed for a time, but the sea forever reached, never content. And across Westeros, other powers took notice, shaping their own plots in answer to the surging naval empire that Margaery and Balon had built. In the cold months that followed their great victory at the mouth of the Mander, Pike settled into a pattern that was half feast, half tension. Storms swept in from the Sunset Sea, battering the towers and bridged walkways. Wind whistled through stone crevices, carrying the briny tang of salt. Within the halls, fires roared in deep hearths, and the Ironborn captains recounted raids of the past season, boasting of spoils and scars. Margaery oversaw all with a calm diligence, ensuring that every success was attributed as much to cunning negotiation and planned maneuvers as it was to the men's valor. She had learned the rhythms of Pike. At times, the wind would howl until dawn, rattling doors and extinguishing torches in gusty drafts. Rain-soaked ravens brought messages from the Reach or beyond. The men who served Balon were no courtiers by nature, yet some had adapted to Margaery's presence with quiet acceptance, even grudging respect. There were still captains who scowled at her behind her back, muttering that the drowned god disapproved of a Greenlander woman shaping Ironborn policy. But none could deny that the alliance with Highgarden had grown the Iron Islands richer and more feared than at any point since the disastrous rebellions past. Balon himself vacillated between crowing about his triumphs like a conquering king and pacing the corridors with pent-up agitation. He was aging, but with age had come a fervor to leave a mighty legacy. Margaery was keenly aware that kings, even self-styled ones, did not always die peacefully in their beds. Some nights, she woke from dreams in which Balon slipped and fell from the tower walkways into the surging sea. Other nights, she dreamed of his iron grip loosening on the throne of salt and rock, and in his place rose a shape with wild, mocking eyes, someone else wearing the Kraken's crown. She had heard rumors of Balon's exiled brother Euron, who roamed far waters. The possibility that Euron might return to challenge Balon was never far from her mind. Still, she pressed onward, shaping the Iron Islands into a bulwark that served House Tyrell's prosperity. Her letters to grandmother Olenna spoke of distributing the spoils from each reaving in ways that nurtured the alliance and dissuaded potential rivals from uniting against them. When the Greyjoys seized a Lyseni ship carrying fine silks and exotic spices, Margaery arranged a distribution of these goods to several key lords in the Reach, as well as to a handful of Ironborn captains who could use them to trade in Old Town. Although some old-school reavers grumbled that Ironborn should not stoop to market dealings, the gold that poured back into Pike's coffers convinced them otherwise. The first real hint of looming trouble arrived by Raven in the last throes of winter. Balon was in the Great Keep, conferring with two of his captains over charts of distant seas, when a servant brought a damp parchment sealed with black wax. The messenger, trembling under Balon's hawk-like glare, explained that it came from Old Wyke. Immediately, the name piqued Margaery's attention. Old Wyke was the island that boasted the most fervent keepers of the ancient Ironborn religion. Many of Balon's more traditional supporters hailed from there, men who believed the Ironborn must be guided by the drowned god alone, not bartered into alliances with mainlanders. Balon dismissed the servant, broke the seal, and read in silence. Margaery watched his face darken. Her breath caught in her throat when he let out a scornful laugh. "They're calling for a kingsmoot," Balon said at last. "Some upstart priests at the Stone Tree want to gather the captains and lords to decide who truly rules the Iron Islands." "Ha!" He flung the parchment aside. "They think me old, that the alliance with the Tyrell woman has made me forget the old way. Fools, all of them." Her stomach tightened. A kingsmoot was no light matter in Ironborn tradition. It was the ancient method by which they sometimes chose or deposed their rulers. Though Balon had taken the title of King of Salt and Rock years ago by force and bloodline, a kingsmoot could indeed challenge his claim if enough captains attended. She recalled stories that Theon Greyjoy once mentioned in passing, about how the mightiest or most cunning Ironborn could sway the gathering with feats or silver-tongued promises. And if Euron Greyjoy's name should appear in that company, it might be enough to tear the Iron Islands apart. Balon refused to treat it seriously. In the days after the Raven arrived, he posted no official response. He continued planning for spring raids and left the letter to collect dust. But Margaery was not so easily reassured. She summoned Yara Greyjoy to speak in private, near a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea. There, half-shielded from prying ears, Margaery asked Yara what she knew. "It's no secret that some of the men resent Father's alliance," Yara said bluntly. "They think we've grown too cozy with Greenland gold, that we've lost our iron edge. The drowned priests on Old Wyke have a voice among them. If they can stir enough captains to their cause, they might call them to gather and cast votes for a new king." Yara paused, biting her lip. "They might also just be testing my father's mettle to see if he'll try to stamp out their talk. If he does, that might spark open rebellion." Margaery's frown deepened. She had walked a delicate line, weaving her diplomacy among men who cared only for strength. "If they truly hold a kingsmoot, do you believe Balon's hold will falter?" Yara hesitated, then shrugged with a frankness that Margaery had come to appreciate. "Father is old. His successes are undeniable thanks in part to you. But the old way is about raids, not alliances. A cunning challenger could say that we've sold the Ironborn's birthright for mainland coin. So, yes, could be dangerous." Margaery realized that if Balon were dethroned by a kingsmoot, her entire web of alliances could collapse overnight. She might find herself cast out, or worse, her family's careful maritime empire would vanish if the new Iron King turned on the Reach. For all the cunning she possessed, she could not bind the Ironborn to the Tyrells if they no longer accepted Balon as their leader. Her only path was to ensure Balon overcame any challenge or that another ruler rose who owed Margaery a personal debt. Neither path was guaranteed. She steeled herself, deciding that she must intervene. Yet she also knew Balon's pride. He would never welcome her meddling in Ironborn succession. So she approached him with subtlety. One evening, she joined Balon for supper in his private solar, a sparse chamber lit by a few guttering candles. The wind rattled the shutters, making the flames dance. The meal was a simple affair. Fish stew, black bread, a flagon of ale. Balon tore off chunks of bread and devoured the stew with a wooden spoon, while Margaery drank sparingly from a cup of watered wine. She began by praising his cunning in forging the alliance that had brought him wealth and fearsome repute. Then she broached the matter of Old Wyke. "My lord, the rumors have not escaped me. If a kingsmoot truly is called, ignoring it might play into your enemy's hands. Perhaps you should appear in person on Old Wyke and show them you remain the true Iron King," she suggested softly. "Your presence might quell the talk before it grows to rebellion." Balon snorted, wiping stew from his beard. "I don't answer to beggars who brandish the drowned god's name and call me a traitor. Let them hold their moot in some barnacled cove. It'll come to nothing." Margaery leaned forward, letting her voice drop to a hush. "Your foes may paint your reluctance as fear. They'll say you hide behind the Reach's gold. But if you stride into their hall and lay your victories bare, if you demand that they kneel or face the Iron Fleet, you'll appear unstoppable." He mulled that over, his brow creasing. Better to send men to Old Wyke and burn those priests out of their caves. Burning priests might stir the Ironborn's ire more than anything, she counseled. Better to prove you hold the drowned gods blessing yourself. Demonstrate that no man can match your strength in arms or cunning at sea. Remind them you are Balon Greyjoy, the Lord Reaper of Pike who humiliated the Lannisters, who overcame every blockade. At your side stands an alliance that fills your coffers. No one can challenge that unless you let them. He studied her through narrowed, sea-gray eyes. She could almost see the war inside him. The old Reaver who loathed to bow to demands, and the practical warlord who recognized the might of appearances. Finally, he grunted, "We'll see. If they press their insolence, I may indeed pay Old Wyke a visit. Let them cower then." The following weeks brought more letters from disaffected priests and captains. While most lacked any explicit call to arms, the tension was unmistakable. Whispers circulated that a certain priest named Delk the Brine-Touched had begun anointing men with salt water, urging them to recall the old way above all else. One name kept cropping up, Euron Greyjoy. Some said Euron had been seen near the stepstones, amassing a fortune by plunder, slaving, and black arts. Others claimed he was dead, but the rumor alone was enough to sow doubt. If Euron returned, might he press a claim at a kingsmoot? As Margaery worried over these possibilities, she received an urgent raven from Highgarden. The letter bore the seal of her father, Mace Tyrell, though the handwriting was rushed. It spoke of a different threat. Lady Cersei Lannister, or perhaps some Lannister cousin acting in the name of the throne, was attempting to broker an alliance with the Redwyne fleet of the Arbor, hinting that Redwyne ships might gain exclusive trading rights through Lannisport if they abandoned Tyrell overlordship. Margaery read the words with growing alarm. House Redwyne controlled one of the most formidable fleets in the Reach, historically loyal to Highgarden. Yet even the promise of gold and expanded trade might tempt certain ambitious lords to switch sides. She realized this threatened to undercut the very maritime supremacy she and Balon had worked so hard to secure. If the Arbor's fleet broke from Tyrell control, the Lannisters might rebuild a naval bulwark on the southwestern seas, forcing the Greyjoys to spread themselves thin in a two-front conflict. Margaery replied at once, urging her father to maintain relations with the Redwynes, possibly by offering an even more advantageous trade arrangement in conjunction with the Iron Islands. She insisted that the Redwyne lords be reminded of the Ironborn's proven might, that if they turned coat, they would face retribution at sea. She also arranged to send an emissary from Pike, a formidable Ironborn captain named Quentyn Saltbeard, who was known for his skill in negotiation as well as a fearsome reputation. The hope was that the Arbor's leaders would be persuaded by both the carrot of Tyrell wealth and the stick of Ironborn axes. These double shadows, one internal, one external, kept Margaery pacing the stony corridors of Pike late into the nights. The storms had not let up. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder boomed across the roiling sea. Still, she refused to let gloom settle. Even as the old fortress rattled with each gust, she swept through its halls in her green and gold finery, appearing every inch the assured mistress of this watery kingdom. She reached out to Yara for updates on the situation at Old Wyke, while also sending coded letters to Olenna Tyrell about the Arbor. The presence of these parallel crises made Margaery more convinced than ever that the alliance needed to tighten its grip. Every day, she convened with Balon's captains, reminding them of how well they had profited under the Tyrell connection. She flattered some, bribed others, and always recast the conversation so that challenging Balon's rule would threaten the coin and spoils that had enriched their entire host. Yara brought back intelligence that the priests on Old Wyke were calling for the Kingsmoot to meet at the stone known as the Grey King's Throne, a windswept amphitheater carved into the cliffs. The moot would likely begin in a moon's time if the lords and captains agreed. And from the rumors drifting in, many were, too many for Balon's liking. Margaery pressed Balon again to attend. At last, with ill grace, he declared that if these upstarts truly intended to gather, he would meet them in person. Yara would accompany him to show the strength of House Greyjoy's immediate lineage. Margaery asked if she might join him as well, but Balon scoffed. A Kingsmoot is an ironborn affair, not for mainlanders. I'll not have them spitting on your feet. Best you stay here in Pike. She feared that if she stayed behind, she could not influence events. Yet pressing further might cause him to rescind his decision to attend at all. With frustration gnawing at her, she let him have his way, hoping Yara might serve as her eyes and ears. Yara, for her part, promised in hushed tones to keep Margaery informed. I have no wish to let the drowned priests tear our house apart, she said. Father and I may not see eye to eye on every matter, but I won't see him dethroned and replaced by some fanatic or, Seven forbid, by Euron. We'll keep them in line. When the day came for Balon and Yara to depart, the dawn broke raw and dark. Balon had gathered 100 ironborn men at the docks below Pike, all sworn to his banner. Their longships would make the short voyage to Old Wyke in a single day, weather permitting. Margaery stood at the top of the fortress steps, her cloak whipping in the wind, watching Balon climb down to the rocks. The sea crashed and hissed around them, sending up spray. She thought to offer him some parting word, but he did not meet her eyes, as though he were already lost in the prospect of confronting his challengers. Only Yara lingered a moment, giving Margaery a curt nod. Margaery pressed a folded slip of parchment into Yara's palm, a coded message for immediate communication if trouble brewed. Yara gripped it tightly, then followed her father onto the longship. The sails unfurled, and the flotilla set off across the churning waters. Margaery stood on that high vantage until the last mast vanished into mist. Only then did she retreat inside, the hollowness in her belly warning her that the future had become perilously uncertain. Days passed like slow-drawn breath. Raven skulls circled overhead during the mornings, a bad omen in the old ironborn superstitions. Storm clouds clustered, but no heavy rains fell, leaving the air thick and oppressive. Margaery found tasks to occupy her mind. She conferred with her household about a pending trade caravan from the Reach. She reviewed a new message from her father that indicated the Arbor's loyalty might yet be secured, and she oversaw small improvements in Pike's main hall, adding fresh rushes and new torches. Yet beneath all that, anxiety gnawed. What was happening on Old Wyke? Finally, a raven arrived near dusk, bearing a brief note in Yara's scrawling hand. The moot gathers. Father stands tall, but discontent runs high. A handful of lords have arrived from Great Wyke and Harlaw, more from Orkmont and Saltcliffe. The priests say they will wait 3 more days for any final arrivals before the choosing begins. Rumors swirl about a stranger inbound from the east. Father is uneasy. Will send more soon. A stranger from the east. Margaery's blood chilled. That could be Euron. She read the note again, hoping she was wrong. Euron had been exiled years ago for monstrous deeds, including the rumored seduction or worse of his own brother's salt wives, and unspeakable atrocities at sea. If that man returned, wearing an eye patch or sporting some exotic finery, with a ship full of sorceress relics and captured warlocks from Essos, he might enthrall the more superstitious among the Ironborn. Balon could find himself facing not just a handful of disgruntled priests but a charismatic brother who had no scruples. She paced her chamber for hours that evening, ignoring the fish stew placed out by her servants. She considered riding out to Old Wyke herself, but she knew Balon would see that as a betrayal, an intrusion into purely Ironborn customs. She wrote a letter to Yara, cautioning her to watch for Euron's arrival, to keep calm, and to remind the gathering of the practical might Balon had brought them. Reavers are well and good, but golden alliances keep the Iron Islands strong. Margaery wrote, praying Yara would find a way to deliver that message. At dawn 2 days later, another raven arrived, this time carrying a note with fewer words, though each struck Margaery like a blow. Euron is here. He has brought wonders from distant lands. The crowds whisper his name. Father is furious. The moot begins today. Margaery could not sit idly. She donned a traveling cloak over her simpler green gown, braided her hair to keep it from blowing wild in the stiff sea winds, and summoned a handful of her most loyal retainers, Tyrell men and a few Ironborn who had sworn direct fealty to her. Word spread that the Lady of Pike would sail for Old Wyke. She did not care if Balon howled with anger. If the Kingsmoot turned against him, her entire world would collapse. She had to be there even if the Ironborn sneered. She set off that same morning with 2 swift longships loaded with men she trusted, ignoring the hush of disapproval from those left behind. The journey to Old Wyke was a grim ordeal. The sky was a swirling mass of pewter clouds, and the sea below frothed with restless currents. Margaery stood at the prow, occasionally braced by her guards, letting the salt spray lash her cheeks. She cast her gaze forward, scanning for the silhouette of Old Wyke's rocky coastline. When at last they rounded a rugged headland, she saw the island looming. A huddle of black cliffs rising from the ocean, crowned by stunted shrubs and jagged rocks. In the distance, she spotted the upright shape of a large natural amphitheater near the shore, the place called the Grey King's Throne. A scattering of ships lay anchored off the coast, and more had pulled into a makeshift harbor of shingle and basalt outcroppings. Many of those banners displayed house sigils she recognized from her time in Pike. Harlaw's Scythe, Blacktide's Drowned Man, Drum's Bone Hand, and so on. Everywhere, men bustled about in the drizzle. Campfires dotted the upper slopes, wisps of smoke drifting upward. Margaery's 2 ships set anchor where they could. There was no formal port, just slippery rocks where Ironborn thralls waited to tie off vessels. Even as Margaery and her retinue disembarked, she saw scowls and puzzled looks from passing warriors. A hush spread. A woman from the mainland did not belong at a Kingsmoot, but Margaery kept her shoulders back and her chin high. She had come too far to quail now. She made her way uphill, the path winding among boulders and sharp ridges. The amphitheater was carved from the living rock of the cliffside, facing the sea so that the crashing waves below could be heard as a constant backdrop. A wide, leveled area served as the moot's heart, where those wishing to speak could stand. Around it, in rising tiers, Ironborn captains and lords sat on stones or driftwood benches. At the upper edges, priests of the drowned god huddled in dripping robes, seaweed entwined in their hair, chanting or calling out supplications. Margaery spotted Balon before anyone else. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy cloak, the gold kraken pinned at his chest. Yara stood beside him, tension etched on her face. And there, on the opposite side of the amphitheater, was Euron Greyjoy, unmistakable even at a glance. His dark hair was shot with streaks of silver, an eye patch covered one eye, and he wore an extravagant coat of shimmering fabric that seemed to glisten with deep blues and purples. Next to him, a small group of men clad in exotic leathers and gold torques whispered among themselves. At Euron's feet lay a battered chest, half open, containing curious items that looked like relics from distant Essos, colorful crystals, a twisted horn made of dragon bone, scraps of silk embroidered with strange symbols. As Margaery approached, she heard Euron's smooth voice echo across the stony enclosure. Why cling to the scraps of the Greenlander alliance when the seas of the world are ripe for plunder? I have sailed beyond the Jade Gates to Ashabai the Shadow to the Basilisk Isles. I have seen wonders you cannot dream of. Cast aside the timid counsel of those who fear the world's wrath. The Ironborn were once the reavers of the known world, and under my banner, we shall be again." Balon made a harsh sound, striding forward. "Shut your lying mouth, Euron," he roared. The crowd tensed as the old Reaper of Pike faced his exiled brother. "You dare stand before us, spouting madness and false promise? You who bedded another brother's salt wives? You who was banished for vile crimes? I am king of salt and rock, recognized by every captain who has sailed under the Kraken banner. My alliance with the Tyrells has brought more gold to the Iron Islands than we've seen in generations, and we have hammered the Lannisters and the crown. What have you ever done but roam about chasing illusions?" Euron laughed, the sound both mirthful and unsettling. "Illusions, brother? Is that what you call dragon horns from Valyria? Spices so rare that merchants in Volantis pay in rubies for a single pinch? I have king's ransoms in my holds. The difference is, I did not whore myself to mainlanders for it." His one uncovered eye flicked, and for the first time, he seemed to notice Margaery in the periphery. "Or perhaps you keep a whore in your bed to win the Greenlanders' favor?" Balon lunged, rage contorting his features. Yara seized his arm, holding him back as the crowd murmured. Margaery felt her heart pound. Euron's slur was dangerous, but she refused to shrink away. Instead, she stepped forward in plain sight, ignoring the shocked gasp that rippled through the onlookers. She raised her voice, speaking in a calm, measured tone that carried through the amphitheater's natural acoustics. "I am Margaery Tyrell of Highgarden, rightful Lady of Pike by my marriage to Balon Greyjoy. Any who doubt my loyalty to the Iron Islands need only recall the victories at sea, the gold that has flowed through your ports, and the power we have wrested from our enemies." A hush fell, broken only by the distant crash of waves. Euron's lips curled into a mocking smile. "Yes, the famed Rose of Highgarden, parading among us. Behold how we have welcomed a foreigner to shape our course. Ironborn, is that what we are meant to be? Tools of the Tyrells? Clinking coins in their purse? I say we are made for conquest. Let the Greenlanders quake in fear at the sight of our sails. Let them kneel for mercy or burn." A few cheers arose at that, though many remained silent, weighing the two men. Balon's voice sliced through the air, gravelly with fury. "You speak of conquest, but you bring only your own vanity. You want to squander Ironborn lives on foolish quests in far corners of the world. And for what? A pile of trinkets? My alliances have brought us real power here now. We have hammered the Lannisters, we've starved the crown, we hold the seas from the Mander to the Arbor, and the gold is ours without crippling losses. Will you argue that is not the true path of an Iron King?" More murmured in the crowd. Some nodded, recalling how in past generations, Ironborn victories often proved ephemeral, costing them entire fleets for short-lived glory. Balon's successes had indeed been consistent, but Euron flared his good eye, radiating a charismatic sort of madness. "You mock me, brother, yet I have tasted wonders beyond your meager understanding. Have you laid eyes on the black walls of Ashai, Balon? Have you braved the currents of the smoking sea near Old Valyria? I have, and I brought back trophies, knowledge, power, enough to make any who stand against me tremble." He gestured to the battered chest, and one of his men lifted out the twisted horn. A hush descended. The horn was huge, ridged with lines that shimmered darkly, etched with glyphs no one present could interpret. An eerie aura seemed to emanate from it. Even Margaery felt a chill at the sight, though she doubted the artifact's authenticity or function. Euron smirked. "This is what the world holds if we dare to claim it. With the right incantation, I am told even dragons can be controlled by such a horn. Imagine the might of the Ironborn if we commanded the sky as well as the sea." Margaery watched the men shift, some clearly dazzled by the prospect. Superstition ran deep here, and talk of dragons, mythic or otherwise, still held power. She could not let Euron's theatrics sway them. She stepped closer, careful to keep her voice calm but resonant. "And yet, for all these exotic baubles, have you conquered a single shore in Westeros? Have you matched House Greyjoy's humiliation of the Lannisters and the crown? Balon Greyjoy has not only expanded the Iron Fleet's might, he has kept it intact. He has grown your riches while preserving your strength. That is not surrender. It is wisdom. Euron cast his gaze over the gathered captains, then barked a laugh. A Greenlander lecturing Ironborn on wisdom. Tell me, Ironborn, do you truly want to spend your days as hired blades for Highgarden's ends? Or do you want to be the stuff of legends again? I have the key. His voice dropped, mesmerizing in its intensity. If you choose me, we will sail farther than any have sailed, and take more than you can imagine. We'll have slaves from Slaver's Bay, we'll hold the Basilisk Isles, we'll become richer than the free cities themselves. That is the future I offer. Balon's knuckles went white around the pommel of his sword. Yara threw a sharp glance at Margaery, clearly concerned. The crowd's mood was too volatile. In a kingsmoot, the captains would cast their voices. Some of the older lords might remember Euron's crimes, but many younger men, enthralled by the romance of far-flung reaving, could rally behind him. Margaery realized that appealing purely to reason might not suffice here. The Ironborn responded to strength, to shows of nerve and raw power. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the raised stone dais where Balon stood. Her voice rang out. You speak of legends, Euron Greyjoy, but legends do not feed the children of the Iron Islands. Legends do not keep your ships afloat when winter storms shred the sails. Balon Greyjoy's rule has done all of that. Ask yourselves, have you gone hungry since our fleets gained dominion over the western seas? Have your wives and daughters lacked for coin? When you dock at Pike, do you not find the storehouses full? The blacksmiths busy forging your weapons? Some men nodded grudgingly. Euron gave her a mocking bow. And at what cost? Bowing to a golden rose, kneeling to the 7 gods. Margaery refused to be cowed. There is no bowing. The Ironborn remain free. We demanded fealty from the Lannisters, not the other way around. And the Tyrell gold you scorn so easily puts new ships in your harbors, new sails on your masts, and fresh steel in your scabbards. She saw in the eyes of certain lords, like Lord Harlaw and Lord Blacktide, a measure of appreciation for that pragmatic argument. She also noted others, especially those from the old lines of Old Wyke, who seemed drawn to Euron's mystique. Balon, seeing an opening, stepped up as well. You claim to have sailed farther than any man, Euron. Yet have you tested yourself against the realm's might as I have? I broke the Lannister fleets not once, but twice. I carried the day against the Crown's blockade. I forced the Tyrells to parley with me on even terms. You speak of shadows and half-truths from across the seas. I deal in victories here in Westeros. Which do you truly believe the drowned god favors? Euron's mouth twisted, and Margaery sensed him pivoting tactics. The drowned god favors boldness. The drowned god favors those who do not rely on mainland alliances. We Ironborn have lost our souls, satisfied with petty raids while we kneel to a rose. That is not the Ironborn way. We take what we want from whomever we want. That's how we once held lands as far as the Riverlands and the Arbor. And that is how we will hold them again. Under me, Euron Crow's Eye, the rightful king of the Isles and the North Sea. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The priests chanted incantations, arms raised to the clouded sky, as if beckoning the drowned god's verdict. One of the priests, a gaunt man with a rope belt, stepped forward. He raised a driftwood staff. Ironborn, you have heard Balon Greyjoy, who has reigned these many years, who renewed our might. You have heard Euron Greyjoy, who brings the promise of distant wonders. RTH, ere others who would speak. Another voice rose, one of the lesser lords from Saltcliff, who offered tepid support for Balon, praising how the old king had restored the Ironborn fleets after the previous rebellion's failures. A second voice, from Harlaw, praised the practical wealth Balon had secured, but also admitted Euron's exotic trophies intrigued him. The moot was clearly split. Arguments flared among smaller groups. Some spat on the ground, cursing the mention of a Greenlander alliance. Others pointed out that they had never known such prosperity as they did under Balon's reign. Seeing the danger, Margaery knew she had to give the Ironborn a show of might that outstripped Euron's illusions. She raised her voice again, this time carrying it with regal command. You question whether the old king is truly free of mainland entanglements. But I stand here to tell you, House Tyrell does not command House Greyjoy. Our alliance was forged by choice, for mutual benefit. The Ironborn remain lords of the sea, unbroken and fierce. If any doubt remains, I challenge you, name your test of Balon's strength. Do you want steel drawn in this place? Let the blood of any challengers soak the stones. Or do you want to see if the drowned god himself spares the truly chosen? Let Balon walk into the waves. If he drowns, then name Euron your king. But if the drowned god sees fit to return him, then respect his crown. That is your tradition, is it not? The drowning ceremony that anoints your kings. Her heart hammered at her own words. She was gambling with Balon's life, but she recalled enough of the Ironborn rituals to know that the drowning ceremony was a perilous test used by the priests. If one survived, the drowned god had supposedly chosen them. If one died, well, that was seen as a verdict as well. She could sense Balon's glare upon her, but she dared not look at him for fear of faltering. Euron let out a short bark of laughter. You would have the old man half drowned in these waters? Ha! He can scarcely stand in the shallows without a crutch. Perhaps I'll fling him off the cliffs myself and see if he floats. Balon bristled, but Margaery pressed on. What about you, Euron Crowseye? Will you walk into the waves as well if the moot demands it? Would you let the priests fill your lungs with salt water to see if the drowned god returns you to us? She saw the flicker in Euron's eye, the slightest hesitation. A drowning ceremony was not always survivable, no matter how strong the man. One required hearty lungs and the blessings of the priests to be revived after near suffocation. Euron's bravado faltered momentarily. I need no such test, he snarled. My proof is in my conquests. Yet the seed was planted. The crowd began to stir, some shouting for the drowning test, others for open combat. Margaery remained calm, letting the Ironborn debate. Finally, the gaunt priest spoke again, in a low, resonant chant. It is the ancient way to anoint a king with the waters of the sea. If a man cannot survive the drowned god's kiss, he is unworthy. If both Balon and Euron will undergo the blessing, let us see who rises again. Balon turned to Margaery with a fury in his eyes that made her blood run cold. But then he jerked his gaze away, scanning the crowd, seeing that the tide of opinion had seized on this notion. The old Reaper of Pike took a step forward. I am Balon Greyjoy, he roared. Lord Reaper, King of the Isles and the Western Seas. The drowned god has favored me all these years, and he will not forsake me now. I accept. A wave of gasps ran through the gathering. Euron sneered, but Margaery caught the fleeting wariness behind that mockery. Fine, Euron said. Let all see that the drowned god favors the bold. I too will accept, if that's what it takes to prove that I am the rightful king. The priest nodded, solemn. Then let the ceremony be done at the next low tide, at the shore below. The men will gather around, and each of you shall be immersed as tradition dictates. We shall see who the drowned god returns. Margaery exhaled shakily. She had not expected Euron to agree so easily. Perhaps his arrogance knew no limit. A part of her worried that Balon's age might be a cruel disadvantage here. Still, there was no turning back. She had invoked an Ironborn custom with the hope that Balon's proven resilience, and Euron's rumored fear of the deep, would decide this swiftly. Yara stared at Margaery with startled alarm, but she did not speak out. Night descended, cold and damp, as the moot disbanded to set up for the morning's tide. Fires dotted the rocky slopes, and the gathered lords muttered among themselves. Some men openly speculated whether Balon could survive such a test. Others bragged that Euron had the cunning to cheat death. Many simply drank and told tales, waiting for the dawn. Margaery, for her part, found Yara and attempted to speak in private. They huddled near a windbreak of piled stones. Yara's voice was low and furious. What have you done? My father's no stripling. A drowning ceremony could kill him. Margaery's own nerves were on edge, but she forced a steady reply. He must show the Ironborn that their traditions validate him. If he had refused, the crowd might have crowned Euron on the spot. This is a chance to demonstrate that the old Reaper of Pike still stands by the drowned god's blessing. Yara's eyes flicked away in frustration. We'll have to trust that the priests can revive him if he goes under. But Euron, I've heard stories. Some say he wears that eye patch to hide a demon's eye. He may have dabbled in black magic. The sea might not claim him as an ordinary man. Margaery set a hand on Yara's arm. He can bleed like any man. Remember that. Euron thrives on fear, but if we do not yield to it, he is less formidable. If Balon emerges victorious, that will quell much of Euron's support. The crowd loves spectacle, and this is a spectacle that can unify them behind your father once more. Yara took a ragged breath and nodded, though her expression was grim. The two women parted. Margaery returned to her small camp, a trio of Tyrell armsmen standing watch. She barely slept. Visions of Balon drowning beneath the waves tormented her, interspersed with haunting images of Euron rising from the sea with inhuman power. Come dawn, the tide was out. A gray, pallid light filtered through the low clouds. The priests, draped in seaweed-stained robes, gathered on a rocky stretch where the sea hissed against black sand. A ring of ironborn captains and lords formed, leaving a clearing in the center. Balon arrived with Yara, his face set in stoic determination. Euron swaggered in soon after, wearing only a loose shirt and breeches, as if mocking the cold. Margaery stood at the edge of the ring, heart pounding. She could feel eyes on her, but she kept her focus on the ceremony. One of the priests raised his arms and cried out in a voice that fought against the wind. We come before the drowned god this day to anoint a king of the Iron Islands. Let him who is worthy be drowned and returned, so that all may witness the blessing of the waters. He beckoned to Balon first. Kneel in the shallows, Balon Greyjoy. Balon strode forward, stepping into the frigid water. It swirled around his calves. The priest, chanting in the old tongue, placed a hand on Balon's head and pushed him down into the surf. For a moment, Balon stiffened, as though resisting the unnatural chill. Then he allowed the priest to press him further, until the water closed over his head. The priest held him there. Margaery caught her breath, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, it felt like an eternity. Waves broke around them, soaking Balon's cloak. Yara stood close by, fists clenched at her sides, ready to intervene if something went wrong. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. Finally, the priest pulled Balon's head up. He spluttered, gasping for air, water streaming from his hair and beard. The priest seized a large driftwood staff and pressed it against Balon's chest, forcing him back under a second time. Margaery's pulse hammered. That second immersion was always the more dangerous part, she had learned. The Ironborn believed in fully drowning the candidate, letting them taste death. Time slowed to a painful crawl. She fought the urge to rush forward. The crowd grew agitated, some chanting for the drowned god, others hurling curses. Salt spray drenched everyone in reach. At last, with savage abruptness, the priest pulled Balon up again. The old king sagged, eyes wide, choking on seawater. The priest stepped back, letting him collapse onto the wet sand, sputtering. Silence stretched. Balon was motionless for a terrifying moment. Then, hacking and gasping, he rolled onto his knees and coughed out brine. A ragged cheer erupted from some, including Yara. Margaery exhaled in relief, tears threatening her composure. Balon Greyjoy, battered but alive, had survived the drowning test. Now it was Euron's turn. He stepped into the water with a devilish grin, as though the cold were nothing to him. The priest repeated the ritual words, then pushed Euron's head under. Margaery stared, her throat tight. The seconds passed. Waves sloshed around the priest's legs. Then Euron was pulled up. He shook his head wildly, spraying water, laughing as he gasped for air. The crowd murmured. Margaery realized he had not fought or panicked at all. His face held a bold, unhinged delight. The priest forced him under a second time. The hush was deafening. Heartbeats seemed to stretch into minutes. Euron did not thrash. At length, the priest hauled him up, and he stumbled, water pouring from his hair. For one terrifying moment, Euron sagged. Then he rose, flinging his arms wide, sending droplets in a wide arc. With a triumphant shout, he drew a breath. More cheers roared from a portion of the crowd. Euron coughed, choking out water, but that mocking grin never left his lips. The priest raised his staff and shouted, "Both men have withstood the drowning. Both have tasted death and returned to us. Let the drowned god guide our choice." He looked uncertain, glancing at the throng. Which man shall be king? Chaos ensued. Voices cried out for Balon, citing his proven leadership. Others bellowed Euron's name, enthralled by his show of brazen fearlessness. Some demanded combat with steel. Others demanded that each man present a boon. Balon, weak from the near drowning, knelt on the sand, still gasping. Euron, though spitting salt water, turned to face the crowd with a flourish, pointing at his battered chest of treasures. "Behold," he rasped, voice still shaking with the water in his lungs. "I brought wonders. To each lord who backs me, I promise a share of wealth from the distant seas. Slaves, gold, relics. We will carve out a new empire that spans from the Sunset Sea to Slaver's Bay." Balon surged upright, Yara helping to steady him. "I have the Iron Fleet," he growled. "I have proven victories in this very realm. Those who stand with me will see even greater wealth as we expand along the coasts. The Lannisters remain cowed. The crown is helpless, and the Tyrell gold flows freely for your brave service." Margaery stepped nearer, braving the swirling water at her ankles. She lifted her chin and addressed the gathered men. "Has Balon ever failed to reward his captains who bring him victory? Has he ever let your families go hungry? When the Lannisters threatened your shores, did Balon not crush them? When the crown's envoys tried to buy your loyalty, did he not cast them aside? You stand today the strongest the Iron Islands have been in living memory because Balon united cunning with ferocity." Euron snarled, wiping salt from his lips. "Do not let them tether your ambition to the narrow confines of Westeros. Under me, Ironborn, you shall plunder the corners of the earth. Let the Greenlanders keep their petty farmland. We will sail beyond the horizon, returning with spoils unimaginable." A bristling argument erupted among the captains. Names were called, alliances threatened. The priest attempted to restore order, but his voice was lost in the clamor. Margaery feared this might escalate into open bloodshed on the beach, with each side drawing weapons. Balon's loyal men closed ranks around him and Yara. Euron's supporters thronged around him. More neutral captains hovered on the edges, uncertain which side to commit to, torn between proven stability and flamboyant promises. Suddenly, a hush fell as a new presence forced its way to the center of the ring. An elderly priest Margaery recognized, robed in sodden rags, his eyes blazing with fervor. He was revered among the Ironborn for his age and wisdom, Aeron Greyjoy, known as Damphair, Balon's youngest brother and a devout servant of the drowned god. The crowd parted in deference. Aeron Damphair turned first to Balon, then to Euron, disgust etched on his face. "I hear your cries," he said. "I see the foreign bride, the gold from the Greenlands, the exotic filth from shadowed seas. But I ask you, men of the Iron Islands, are we still the people who worship the drowned god above all else? Or have we become thralls to outsiders and illusions?" He looked at Balon. "Brother, you have accomplished many feats for the Ironborn. You have brought us wealth and fear among our enemies. Yet you also have forsaken the old way, forging bonds with those who do not revere our faith. You stand closer to a Greenlander queen than you do to the drowned god's own priests." Balon, still trembling with the aftereffects of drowning, glowered but did not speak. Aeron then turned to Euron. "You, Euron, I despise above all. You have walked dark paths, defiled your own family, consorted with warlocks and vile magics. Do not pretend that your cause is the old way. You seek only power for yourself." Euron's lips curled. "And yet I emerged from the waves, priest. Did the drowned god not return me?" Aeron hissed, spittle flecking his beard. "The drowned god tests us all, but the presence of breath in your lungs does not make you favored. I have had visions of you, brother, entwined in black tentacles that come from deep waters. The drowned god showed me your sins. You would lead us to doom." Euron sneered, but some of his supporters shrank back, uneasy at Aeron's unmistakable conviction. The priest thrust his staff into the sand. "I say we break from illusions of outside glory or the tyranny of coin. Let the Iron Islands chart a path that is truly blessed by the drowned god, with a ruler who keeps the old ways, not for personal gain but for the people." A wave of excited murmurs passed through the throng, and Margaery felt a flicker of apprehension. Aeron Damphair's position seemed to oppose both Balon's alliance and Euron's black sorcery. Was he calling for a third candidate, someone who might claim a purer devotion to the drowned god? Aeron raised his voice further, seizing the moment. "Let the captains speak. You have heard Balon and Euron. If any other claimant stands among you who can unite the Iron Islands under the old way without bending knee to outsiders or foul magic, come forth." Margaery's gaze shot to Yara. She saw the faintest glimmer of possibility in the younger Greyjoy's eyes. Yara Greyjoy was beloved by many of the Ironborn for her skill in battle, her unwavering loyalty, and her proven leadership over raiders. In another time, a woman might have struggled to claim the kingship among such a patriarchal people, but Yara's feats at sea had already earned her a measure of respect. Could she command the Moot's favor where Balon might fail? Yet Yara stood silent, torn. She glanced at her father, who still coughed, struggling to stand without wavering. The old Reaper seemed determined to maintain his claim. No other voices emerged from the crowd, though a handful of men whispered among themselves, perhaps discussing if another captain might step forward. Aeron slammed his staff again. "Then we must choose from these. Speak your votes, captains, by the laws of our forefathers. Shout the name of the one you would have as king, that all may hear. Let the drowned god judge us by this choice." The next moments were a cacophony of shouts as each captain declared his preference. Some roared, "Balon Greyjoy!" Others hollered, "Euron Crow's Eye!" Others wavered, glancing around to see which way the tide might turn. Margaery's stomach knotted, felt too close as though the moot could tip either way. Her eyes darted among the men, gauging their allegiances. Some who had once followed Balon unwaveringly were swayed by Euron's promise of boundless plunder. Others, uncertain about Euron's rumored abominations, clung to Balon's proven track record. Then a voice bellowed from behind the ring, "Yara Greyjoy!" Heads turned. A young captain from Great Wyke repeated the cry, "Yara Greyjoy! She's proven in raids, loyal to the Iron Islands, not mired in the old man's deals nor the Crow's Eyes madness. Yara Greyjoy for queen!" A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Yara's face paled, then flushed. She opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Balon glared, a mixture of pride and confusion. Euron's grin twisted into a sneer. Then another voice joined in, "Aye, Yara Greyjoy. She took Deepwood Motte in the north. She's commanded the Black Wind in battle after battle." Some men booed or cursed, claiming no woman could be king. Others shouted their approval, citing Yara's bravery. The ring fractured into three camps: Balon's stalwarts, Euron's enthralled supporters, and a scattering of men calling for Yara. Margaery felt the ground shift beneath her feet. If the moot truly divided three ways, what chance did Balon have? Unless Yara rallied to her father's side, splitting the newcomer supporters from Euron. But would that be enough? Aeron's face contorted with dismay. He did not relish the notion of a woman ruling, nor of fracturing the Greyjoy line. He hammered his staff again. "Silence! We will have order in the drowned god's presence." But the captains were not silenced. Arguments flared. Swords started clattering free of scabbards. Margaery sensed that if calm was not restored, blood would spill. She threw a desperate look at Yara, who turned to her father. Balon's eyes were fierce, as though he was prepared to fight every man who doubted him. Euron egged on his supporters, flashing that manic grin. Margaery stepped onto a higher rock, raising her hands. "Ironborn, Do not disgrace yourselves with a brawl when the entire realm watches. You are feared for your discipline at sea, your iron will. Shall you descend into a rabble here on your holy shore? Some men quieted, but the tension remained. She continued, I stand beside Balon Greyjoy. He is the father of your prosperity. Let no one forget that. But if Yara Greyjoy claims the throne, at least it remains in the same storied line that has led you to victory time and again. Euron's path is untested, riddled with horrors. Euron barked a laugh. So you'd rather see a woman take the seastone chair than me? Are you so afraid of my power? She shot him a withering look. I fear you only in that you would lead these men to a fruitless doom. It is better the Iron Islands remain allied with the Reach than chase illusions in unknown seas. Men kept shouting for a time, but one by one, the captains realized they had to choose. A handful, devoted traditionalists, refused to accept Yara's leadership on principle. They clung to Balon out of habit or conviction. Others, who found Balon too old or too entangled with mainlanders, turned to Euron. A few who admired Yara's martial deeds continued chanting her name. The chaos was absolute. Into that swirl of voices came a sudden crack of thunder. Overhead, lightning flashed across the water. Rain, which had held off all morning, now began to pelt down in stinging sheets. The sea roared, and the tide began its relentless advance across the pebbled beach. The waves lapped at the ring of watchers, forcing them to step back. It felt as if the very sky might tear open. The priest Aaron Damphair raised his hands in a frantic supplication. The drowned god sends us a sign. In the flickering light, Margaery saw Euron's single eye gleam with savage delight, as though he took the storm as a personal endorsement. Balon tried to steady himself against the wind. Yara shielded her father from the gust, but he stood firm. The roars of men mixed with the bellow of thunder until no words were discernible. Desperate, Margaery locked eyes with Yara. If the crowd truly splintered, Euron might seize the moment. So she used the only leverage she had. In a voice pitched just enough to cut through the cacophony, she shouted, Yara Greyjoy, will you stand with your father if the moot demands a single leader? Or do you claim the throne yourself? Yara was drenched by the pounding rain, hair plastered to her skull. She flashed a fierce look of indecision. Then she seized Balon's arm. He is the king, she bellowed. My father's the one who's led us to greatness. That was an answer of loyalty, if not an outright rejection of her own claim. Balon's lips compressed into a tight line, but he nodded to his daughter. A few disappointed calls for Yara turned into a handful of curses or shrugs. The men who had championed her began shifting their allegiance. Either they returned to Balon or they drifted uncertainly. Euron, seeing his advantage slipping, roared for them to stand strong. Do not let them cower in the face of a dying man and a foreigner. One of Euron's men, a tall reaver with a scar across his jaw, brandished an axe. Crow's Eye is the future, he shouted. We take what we want. He lunged toward Balon. Instantly, Balon's loyal men rushed forward, weapons out. The ring of watchers exploded into clashing steel. Screams tore the air as the tide washed around their ankles. Thunder rattled the cliffs. Margaery stumbled back to avoid the swirl of violence. Ironborn were hacking at one another, and the priests wailed. Euron's supporters tried to push inward, but Balon's men held them off. Yara's sword flashed. She beat back a pair of reavers who lunged at her father. Euron himself was laughing, slashing with a curved blade as if the storm and bloodshed were a grand jest. A grim sense of dread filled Margaery. This was no mere debate. It was turning into a pitched melee that could shape the future of the Iron Islands. She had to ensure Balon survived. She motioned to her Tyrell guards to form a small phalanx, pressing through the chaos. Rain sluiced down in sheets. Blood slicked the whetstones. She glimpsed Balon stumbling, fighting off an attacker. Yara struck the man down. Euron's cackling rang in her ears. Suddenly, Euron saw Margaery's approach. He launched himself forward, knocking aside a ragged warrior in his path. That twisted grin marked his face, as though he recognized that she, too, was a pivotal figure in all of this. He might have been aiming to take her hostage, to slay her outright, or to revel in the drama. Margaery didn't wait to find out. She ducked behind one of her guards, who raised a sword. Euron's blade flashed, parrying with unnatural speed. He shoved the guard aside and lunged at Margaery, who scrambled backward, her boots sliding on the slick stones. The world narrowed. She could hear nothing but her own pounding heartbeat and the roar of the storm. She glimpsed Euron's one good eye, brimming with savage glee. A second guard interposed, blocking Euron's strike. Sparks flew. Margaery stumbled, feet tangling in the rising tide. Water splashed around her ankles. She fumbled for the small dagger she kept concealed beneath her cloak. She had never been a warrior, but she would not die cowering. Then, in a rush of movement, Yara barreled into Euron from the side, her shoulder colliding with his. Her sword swung in a vicious arc, forcing him to spin away or lose a limb. "Touch her, Crow's Eye, and I'll slit your throat," Yara snarled. Euron grinned even as he retreated a step. Then Balon was there, panting, brandishing a heavy sword. "Hold him," Balon gasped. Euron tried to dart away, but two of Balon's men pinned him, axes at his throat. The crowd was thinning now, as the melee abated. Euron's supporters had been driven off or subdued, though a few might regroup. The water was knee-deep near the center of the ring. Corpses or wounded men floated or sprawled on the rocks. The priest, trembling, surveyed the carnage. Balon, face contorted with pain and fatigue, loomed over Euron, sword raised. "Brother, you are finished." Rain hammered them, flattening Balon's hair to his skull. Euron twisted in his captor's grip, a bloody grin on his lips. "You cannot kill me," Euron said through his teeth. "For the drowned god brought me back. End me here, and you'll have a curse upon your head forever." Yara sneered. "Better a curse than let you tear our islands apart." Balon hesitated, sword trembling. Some part of him knew that kinslaying carried a terrible stigma. But if he spared Euron, the man would remain a threat. Margaery, still breathing hard from the near collision, forced her voice to steady. "If you show him mercy, he'll only return to challenge you again. You must end it, my lord." Euron's single eye flicked toward Margaery. "Ah, the sweet rose thirsts for blood," he mocked, even pinned as he was. "You think taking my head ends this? My tide is rising, woman. I have seen visions in the flames of Volantis, in the black pools of Ass-High." Balon's sword crashed down, cutting off Euron's words. The blow cleaved into Euron's collar. Blood sprayed across the churning water. Euron's grin froze. The next moment he collapsed, eyes empty. The men holding him flinched, letting him slide into the rising tide. Water gurgled around his body, swirling it away from the ring. Balon stood over the corpse, chest heaving, blood mixing with salt water. A hush fell, broken only by the dying cries of the wounded and the pounding waves. Margaery swallowed hard, staring at the broken body of Euron Greyjoy. She felt no pity. The threat he posed had been monstrous. Yet she recognized the gravity of what Balon had done. He had slain his own brother, a kinslaying that might stain his name. But in this moment, among the Ironborn, practicality overcame taboo. Euron had challenged the rightful king, spurred a riot, and threatened the realm's fragile peace. Balon had put an end to it. Aaron Damphair stood trembling, staff clutched in both hands. He looked upon Euron's body with horror. Then, with a wavering tone, he turned to the battered crowd. "The drowned god has judged. Euron is taken by the sea. Balon Greyjoy remains. All hail the king of salt and rock." A ragged chorus of voices shouted agreement. Some, who had once sided with Euron, kept silent, but no one rose to protest. They had just witnessed Balon's unwavering resolve, and Euron's bloody end. Balon sagged against Yara, who supported him. Margaery hurried forward, ignoring the swirling water around her thighs. She placed a hand on Balon's arm, feeling the trembling exhaustion beneath. He cast her a look that was one part gratitude, one part accusation. She had forced his hand with the drowning challenge, and now with Euron's death. But the moment was overshadowed by relief, for the crisis was ended, at least for now. By midday, the storm had eased slightly, though rain continued to fall. The Kingsmoot, in its chaotic fashion, had been decided through violence and dread ritual. Balon was still the Iron King. Many men died in the fray, but none seemed eager to renew the fight. Aaron Damphair led a final chant for the drowned god, proclaiming that Balon's survival signaled divine favor. Margaery hovered close to Balon as they trudged away from the tide's reach, the crowd dispersing. A few captains muttered curses about the foreigners or about Euron's death, but no one openly challenged the outcome. Yara walked beside her father, blade still in hand, scanning for any final threats. Balon coughed, spitting seawater. His eyes glinted with painful triumph. "Did you plan this?" he rasped at Margaery, voice nearly lost in the wind. She shook her head. "Not precisely, but I knew a test of faith might be the only way to bring the Ironborn to heel. Euron forced your hand, my lord." "Indeed he did," Balon said, a weary grimace on his face. "It seems I'll never be free of cursed ambition in this family." She offered a slight nod. She could have said more, about how the alliance with the Reach was the surest path to lasting power, but he was too exhausted for a debate. And in truth, this day's events had proven that nothing was certain among the Iron Islands. Even so, it ended with Balon still upon the seastone chair, and Euron a corpse adrift in the tides. For the moment, the alliance stood. That was enough. They returned to Pike in subdued procession. Though battered and soaked, Balon refused to linger on Old Wyke. As soon as the seas calmed enough for safe travel, he boarded his flagship with Yara and Margaery by his side. The men who had followed Euron quietly scattered, some pledging loyalty to Balon anew, others slinking away to nurse their wounds. On the voyage back, Margaery huddled in her cabin, writing out a brief account of the events for her grandmother. The words felt surreal. Euron's arrival, the drowning test, the bloodshed. She withheld nothing. She wanted Olenna to understand precisely how narrow their victory had been. Back at Pike, the fortress seemed both familiar and ominous after the madness on Old Wyke. Balon took to his chambers, a persistent cough racking his lungs. The near drowning had taxed him more than he would admit. Yara summoned the best healers they had, crude Ironborn men who used seaweeds and poultices. Margaery insisted on sending for a maester from the arbor. Balon, too tired to argue, relented. For several days, Balon's life hung in uncertainty. Fever spiked. He coughed up bloody sputum. At times, he raged in delirium, cursing Euron, cursing the sea. Yara and Margaery alternated in caring for him, forcing him to drink healing draughts. Priests of the drowned god came, chanting over his bed, though Margaery suspected their presence did more for morale than for actual healing. The keep was tense, as each day's question was whether the king would live or die. Yara tried to keep the captains in line, reassuring them that Balon would recover, that the alliance with the Reach remained strong. To everyone's relief, Margaery's especially, he began to rally. The fever broke. His cough eased. By the end of the following week, he could rise from bed, though he still walked with unsteady steps. Margaery visited him at midday, finding him seated in a chair by a window that overlooked the gray sea. The wind whipped the curtains, and the smell of salt permeated the chamber. Balon stared out as if measuring the waves. She inclined her head. "My lord, you look improved." He gave a dry laugh that turned into a cough. "I feel half drowned, half dead, but alive, thanks to the drowned god or your meddling. Or both." She did not bristle at the slight. "I am pleased you live. The Iron Islands need you. And, if I may say so, the Reach does too." He waved a hand as though swatting a fly. "Spare me the courtesies. I know I owe you some gratitude. Without your push, Euron might have seduced the moot entirely." She offered a careful smile. "We all serve the same cause, to preserve the strength we've built." Balon's gaze was distant. A Kingsmoot, the drowning, Euron's death. So many dead or wounded. This cost is high. Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. Then his old defiance reasserted itself. But no matter, Euron is gone, and the Iron Islands remain mine. I will not falter again. If any man rises to challenge me, I'll send him to the drowned god. Margaery did not doubt it. She drew closer to him, speaking softly. My father writes that the Redwynes have agreed to remain loyal to Highgarden. Our alliance stands, even after these storms. Balon nodded. Good. With Euron's men scattered, we can focus on the sea lanes once more. Let the Lannisters creep out of their holes if they dare. A final cough racked him. Then he closed his eyes and exhaled. You have ambition, Margaery. I see that. You shape events as deftly as any catspaw of King's Landing. I suppose you learned that from the vipers at court. I don't begrudge your cunning. Perhaps it's what we needed. She allowed a hint of relief to wash over her. For all their friction, Balon seemed to accept her role, and that acceptance might be the best she could hope for. Then let us move forward together. We can strengthen the ties between the Iron Islands and the Reach so thoroughly that no raving pretender can break them. He gazed at her, eyes still rimmed with the darkness of illness. Once I would have spat on such talk. Now I see the use in it. But do not presume to rule me. I am the king here. She dipped her head, her voice neutral. Of course, my lord. Yet she could not hide the small smile that curved her lips. She knew that for all his words, Balon's reign now rested partly on her designs. Their fates were entwined more than ever. The choice to drown them both had sealed that fact in blood and salt. As Balon recovered, the tension among the Ironborn gradually eased. Word spread that Euron was dead, that Balon had survived the drowned god's test. Most of the captains who had wavered returned to the fold, craving the stability that Balon's rule offered. Yara oversaw punitive measures against a handful of Euron's remaining loyalists, confiscating their ships or forcing them into smaller raids far from the main fleet. Margaery wholeheartedly supported that purge, ensuring no second rebellion simmered beneath the surface. Yet the memory of the Kingsmoot lingered as a warning. The Iron Islands were never fully tamed. One spark of discontent, and a new pretender might rise. Balon's alliance with the mainland had to remain undeniably beneficial. Margaery thus threw herself into consolidating the iron grip on maritime trade. She arranged for new ports of call along the Reach's coast that welcomed Ironborn ships with open arms, offering cheaper docking fees and access to valuable cargo. In turn, the Iron Fleet left those coasts untouched by raids, focusing their reaving instincts on Lannister and Baratheon shipping. The result was a blossoming of commerce and an ever-thickening net around the southwestern seas. Many months slipped by, and the alliance, battered by storms both literal and metaphorical, endured. Balon's health stabilized, though he walked with a slight limp from an old wound that flared in the damp. He continued to personally oversee the Iron Fleet's major campaigns, with Yara leading the vanguard. Margaery remained the public figure of courtesy, skillfully ensuring that the wealth from each success was redistributed to keep the Ironborn satisfied and the Tyrells empowered. She exchanged letters with Olenna, detailing how the redwood logs from the north could be brought to the Iron Islands to build new ships, how the Shield Islands might be expanded into a forward base. Bit by bit, the dominion of the Kraken and the Rose spread across the waves. Some whispered that Margaery held a deeper power over Balon, perhaps even having cast some southern spell on him. Others said it was the other way around, that she was trapped in a loveless marriage to a warlord who kept her as a trophy. Yet the truth lay somewhere in between. They were allies in ambition, each using the other to further a joint empire. And if that empire demanded compromise, if Margaery had to endure the grim towers of Pike and Balon had to accommodate the Greenlander's coin, then so be it. Both recognized that together, they wielded more power than either could claim alone. Eventually, even the shock of Euron's doom faded into the annals of Ironborn storytelling, though the bards embellished the details. They sang of how the crows I sought to overshadow the old reaper, only to be struck down by the combined might of father, daughter, and the lady from the south. Some legends claimed Euron's body never surfaced again because some monstrous kraken carried it off to the depths. Others whispered that his spirit roamed the seas, cursing Balon's line. But these were tales told in alehouses on stormy nights, rarely heeded by those who had to navigate real storms. Time shaped Margaery further into an iron-born lady, though she never abandoned her faith in the Seven or her ties to the Tyrell family. She wore sturdy boots and cloaks that repelled sea spray, consulted tide charts with the best navigators, and learned to read the subtle cues of the weather. She even oversaw the building of a new ship named the Saffron Rose, financed by her personal coffers, which served as a diplomatic vessel traveling between Highgarden and Pike. Its figurehead combined the shape of a kraken with the outline of a blooming rose, an emblem that caused as much curiosity as scorn among the more traditional Ironborn. On the mainland, the chessboard of power responded to the Tyrell Greyjoy behemoth. The Lannisters, crippled by repeated losses at sea, focused on fortifying their land frontiers. The Crown, if it could still be called that, had no navy to challenge them. Dorne watched warily, forging its own deals. In King's Landing, courtiers gossiped that Margaery Tyrell, who once aimed for a throne in the Red Keep, had found a kingdom far more dangerous and free upon the waves. Some said she was the true queen, overshadowing Balon with her cunning. Others believed the pair to be unstoppable together. None dared to test them openly. As the seasons turned and bountiful harvests cycled through the Reach, the relationship between Pike and Highgarden deepened. House Tyrell continued to supply the Iron Islands with precious resources, wood, grain, metals, while the Greyjoys enforced the Tyrell's dominion by crippling any maritime threat. Joint fleets patrolled the coasts, the Rose Banner flying alongside the Kraken in a display that would once have seemed unimaginable. Merchant galleys from the free cities carefully negotiated safe passage, knowing that only by paying tribute or forging pacts could they avoid the unstoppable wrath of those warships. Of course, the personal bond between Balon and Margaery remained complicated, but there were moments of genuine understanding. Once, she found him staring at an old tapestry of the Greyjoy sigil in the musty hall. He murmured that he remembered a time when the entire realm mocked the Ironborn as second-rate pirates. "They forget now," he said with pride, "because we forced them to forget." Margaery placed a hand on his shoulder, saying that no matter how the histories were written, the achievements of this era could not be denied. For a brief instant, he put a hand over hers, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had done this together. Inevitably, new strife and fresh threats would arise in a realm as vast as Westeros. Ambitious lords from the Riverlands or the Stormlands might attempt to carve out influence, pirates from the Stepstones might raid shipping lanes, or the old specter of winter and White Walkers might bring horrors from the north. But for the present, Margaery Tyrell Greyjoy savored the realization that she had forged her own destiny, transcending the docile role once expected of her. The fragile rose had flourished in a place of salt and twining her vines around the iron pillars of Balon's rule, so that neither could be easily torn down without the other. And perhaps that was the truest measure of power. Not a single throne in a single city, but a dominion woven across the waters themselves, binding land and sea in an unbreakable net of alliances, trade, and the ever-ready threat of iron might. If the rest of Westeros had once doubted that a Tyrell Rose and a Greyjoy Kraken could merge, they would doubt no longer. From Old Town to Fair Isle, from the Shield Islands to the Blackwater Bay, rumors carried the same message. The seas belonged to Highgarden and Pike alike, and none who set sail dared forget it. Late one evening, as gulls screeched outside Pike's walls, Margaery stood upon the fortress's highest balcony, gazing westward. The sun dipped into the waves, painting the horizon in molten gold. The wind tugged at her hair, and she inhaled the brine-tinged air with a sense of grim satisfaction. She recalled, with bitter amusement, the first day she had arrived on these shores as a nervous bride, trying not to retch from the rolling deck of a ship. She was no longer that timid newcomer. She had faced storms, faced the savage hearts of men, faced the drowning test by proxy. She had learned how to hold her own in a land that revered strength above all else. No one could say for certain what would become of the Iron Islands in another generation, or what new upheavals might ripple across Westeros. But for now, Margaery Tyrell Greyjoy had achieved something that none before her could claim: She had truly fused the savage power of salt and iron with the fertile cunning of root and stem. In her bedchamber, she still lit candles before a small statue of the mother and the warrior, quietly praying for the safety of her homeland and the men who rode the waves. Yet she also let the drowned god's tide swirl around her ankles, stepping across the wet stones of Pike with unflinching resolve. And as the final rays of light glimmered across the darkening sea, she thought of a line from an old ballad. Between the crack of thunder and the hush of dawn, a rose can bloom even in the brine. She smiled faintly. Let them remember her as they would, the cunning rose, the queen of the waves, the bride of the kraken. She had outlasted them all, forging a new chapter in the saga of Westeros. The sea roared, as if in accord, and Margaery Tyrell Greyjoy turned away from the sunset to attend to her duties, each footstep echoing on the stones like the beats of a distant drum.